by the year 720, a unified Arab empire stretched all the way from France to the borders of China. This astonishingly massive landmass had been conquered in the span of just 3 generations by an elite core of heavily militarized and driven people, skilled at war, though motivated by a revolutionary worldview, a new and unique monotheistic religion. Yet, just 45 years later, the descendants of those Muslim conquerors found their lands very nearly torn apart by tribal quarrels, religious tensions within the faith, and regional revolts from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Astonishingly, just 5 years later, the old regime with its heartlands in Syria, dominated by the Umayyad family, was no more, replaced by a new and revitalized dynasty, descended from a member of the House of the Prophet himself, the Abbasids. From then on, until their own demise some 200 years later, the Abbasids would dominate much of the known world. Remarkably, this transition from imperialist Umayyad caliphs to cosmopolitan Abbasids was relatively smooth, resulting in much of the empire simply changing hands rather than breaking away into independent states, such as happened after the decline of the Abbasids in the 9th and early 10th centuries. For historian Hugh Kennedy, the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th and 9th centuries was as central and pivotal to world history as the Roman Empire was in the 1st and 2nd. Like the Roman Empire, its legacy was to influence politics and the development of society for generations to come. Yet, it wouldn't have been possible without the dynasty that came before. The Umayyad state had been an authoritarian empire based on the ethnic division between Arabs and everyone else. The Abbasid state was remarkably diverse, drawing as much from pre-Islamic Persian tradition as Arabian. But how did this new world come into existence? And how did it dominate for close to 200 years to come? This is the story of the Abbasid Revolution, one of the first revolutions in history, and tragically, in the West at least, one of the least well known. This video is a collaboration between 19 other history channels. Be sure to check out the other videos in the playlist, in particular Epimetheus and Al-Muqaddimah. There are links to everything in the description below. In the year 720, a visitor from the east arrived at the obscure settlement of Humayma on the northern edge of the Arabian desert. An arid wasteland today, in ancient days the region had been home to NABATAEAN farmers, the builders of the ancient city of Petra, and an incredibly complex system of hydraulic engineering in the wasteland. Yet, that stranger hadn't come to the region to marvel at the garden made out of desert by those early Arabs. His name was Bukayr ibn Mahan, originally from the Iraqi city of Kufa. He had already travelled across much of the known world, fighting as a Ghazi warrior in the apocalyptic struggle against the Byzantine Empire in the mountains of Anatolia, before traversing the Silk Road all the way to the cities of Central Asia at the far limits of the Muslim world. Such was his right as an Arab, a de facto member of the still very small ruling class of the still relatively new Umayyad Caliphate. And now, at the first half of the 8th century, he had come to the deserts of modern-day Jordan to seek out an obscure gentleman who lived there. Muhammad ibn Ali was a man of modest wealth, living in virtual retirement in the Arabian borderlands. Once, long ago, he had held some influence, but now he was content to live out his days on his small holding. Yet, Muhammad was no normal Arabian gentleman. He just so happened to be one of the few surviving members of the house of the Prophet Muhammad. His ancestor had been Abbas, uncle and stalwart follower of the Prophet, in the days before governance had been claimed by the Umayyads at the point of a sword. For the Umayyads were not related to the Prophet, often finding themselves directly opposed to those who were, notably at brutal battles such as KARBALA and the Battle of the Camel, which would later prove to be rallying cries to their enemies. Since Muhammad's death some 90 years earlier, much of the world had been conquered by those carrying his message, though his family now had no say in matters of state. In fact, very few had any say in the governance of the empire, only Arabian Muslims from the right families being given any chance at holding power or wealth. Due to stringent taxes and an immovable social system, even new converts to Islam had no say whatsoever. From the reign of the Caliph Abd al-Malik onwards, Umayyad rule had essentially equated to rule from Syria, a situation that alienated many Iraqis, a province which had a much larger population than Syria, especially in the extremely fertile southern lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Like many Iraqis, Buqayya saw the Umayyads as usurpers and tyrants. During his travels in Khorasan, at the far reaches of the Islamic world, he had spoken to many of the new converts to Islam, as well as the many thousands of Iraqis who had moved into the region, gauging their opinions and feelings. What he found there had intrigued him, for many in Khorasan had sentiments in favour of the family of the Prophet and against the Umayyads. Buqayya saw the family of Abbas as a means to an end, and he urged Ali to tap into this sentiment. He agreed. Of course, it would be near impossible to launch open revolt in Iraq, with the elite Syrian army standing ready to crush any opposition, as they had done so many times before. It was far away on the other side of the world that the two men would try their luck. At first, travelling as merchants to avoid the wrath of the authorities, agents dispatched by the two men would gradually fan the flames of rebellion in Khorasan. Thus, the seeds of insurgency were sown, an underground movement known as HEPTHALITE, named for a common ancestor of both the family of Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, and Abbas, his uncle, which eventually, close to 3 decades later, would blossom into full-scale revolt and the overthrow of the old regime. Though neither of these two men would see it completed, the Abbasid revolution, one of the first in history, had begun. When the Muslims first arrived in Khorasan during the late 7th century, they found there a diverse plethora of tribes and peoples. Vast ancient cities, built even before the time of Alexander the Great, shared the same landscape as numerous steppe peoples. Sogdian merchants, Hephthalite horse lords, Iranian noblemen descended from the great families of the Sassanian Shahs, as well as Turkic newcomers, and even Chinese travellers from the great Tang Empire to the east. The Arabs had already conquered one empire in its entirety, and half of another, but now they had travelled into the lands beyond, never fully taken by the Sassanians. After the initial conflict, the magnates of the region mostly came over to the Arab side, with many of them retaining their previous territories and positions of power. 50,000 families were then sent from Kufa and Basra, leading to a fairly rapid conversion to Islam, and eventually, by around 700, unlike the rest of the empire, assimilation between Arab and the local population had begun. The Umayyads, of course, did not approve of this. Throughout the empire, the vast majority of people were still non-Muslims, and they paid a tax for the privilege. Only in Khorasan and Iraq did mass conversion begin to take place. These areas would be hotbeds for resistance against the regime. Arabs dominated the bureaucracy and the military, and were housed in fortresses separate from the local population. Even after converting to Islam, non-Arabs, of which there were many in Khorasan, were not allowed to live in these garrison cities. The non-Arabs were not allowed to work for the government, nor could they hold officer positions in the Umayyad military, and they still had to pay the jizya tax for non-Muslims. The vast expanse of Khorasan, coupled with its low population density, meant that the Arab settlers here, both military and civilian, lived largely outside of the garrisons built during the spread of Islam. This was in contrast to the rest of the Umayyad provinces, where Arabs tended to seclude themselves in fortresses and avoid interaction with the locals. In order to survive and be successful, Arab settlers in Khorasan left their traditional lifestyle behind to settle amongst the native Iranian people. While intermarriage with Arabs elsewhere in the empire was heavily discouraged and mostly banned, this gradually became a habit within eastern Khorasan. Over time, some Arabs even began to adopt Persian dress, and as the two languages began to influence one another, ethnic barriers came down. The main Arab power base was set up at Merv, already a vast metropolis, possessing huge Cyclopean sloped walls by the time of the Achaemenid Persians some 1,000 years earlier. Eventually, Merv became one of the most devout centres of Islam in the empire, and in time, due to its opposition of Umayyad policy, centre of support for the family of the Prophet Muhammad. It was here in the early 720s that the Hashimiyya, the first Abbasid missionaries sent from Iraq, found their first recruits. Of course, always leaving the details deliberately vague, so as to attract as much support as possible from all walks of life, simply seeking a member of the house of the Prophet who shall be pleasing to everyone, without making explicit mention of the Abbasids. Unlike the Alid revolts, which were open and straightforward about their demands, the Abbasids slowly built up an underground resistance. Secret networks and propaganda used to build a power base in the eastern Muslim lands. The main message preached was that if all Muslims were to support a member of the house of the Prophet, then the rule of the Umayyads could be overthrown, and the interests of all Muslims, not just Arabs, could be safeguarded. In order to do this, the memories of the first and second fitnas or civil wars was used, in particular the Battle of KARBALA and other perceived atrocities of the Umayyads, proving to be important rallying cries for rebel sects. These missions met with some success, both amongst Arabs and non-Arabs, although the latter, perhaps some of them descended from the great houses of the old Sasanian Empire, may have played a particularly important role in the growth of the movement. On a sun-scorched plain in northern Arabia, not too far from Muhammad ibn Ali's house at Humayma, there is a castle, one of the best preserved of the many desert palaces built by the Umayyad Caliphs. In style, the site is reminiscent of a Roman villa. One of the empires whose provinces the early Arabs had conquered entirely. Though other unique features hark back to the nomadic days of their forefathers, perhaps designed in part to retain the support of the Bedouin desert tribes of the region. The palace had been built in the first half of the 8th century by the Umayyad prince Walid ibn Yazid, renowned as a decadent hedonist in his early years. The Casa Amra is often seen as an apt representation of the Umayyads as a whole. Inside the palace, preserved by its arid rain-parched environs, still survives a unique set of painted frescoes from the heyday of the Umayyads, reminiscent of those found in Roman ruins, with no concern for the later taboo on the artistic depiction of individuals. This 1300-year-old painting depicts 6 kings, presumably world leaders, humbled by Walid's ancestors. Clearly visible is a Byzantine emperor, a Sasanian Shah, the Negus of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia, and Roderick, king of the Visigoths, along with 2 other figures, perhaps a Chinese emperor, Turkic Khan, or Indian king. Just like the early Romans and countless empires after them, the Umayyad Empire had largely been built on infrastructures already existing in the lands they conquered. Systems developed by the Sasanian Shahs, whose realm was swallowed entirely into the Arabic Empire, and the Roman emperors, who lost much of their lands and cities. Clearly, the Umayyads wouldn't have been able to conquer an empire of such a size without having people on side. Only the Persian Achaemenids had managed to conquer both Syria, Iraq and Iran before them, and the Arabs did it in record time. There were many in the exhausted and war-torn Byzantine and Persian empires in the early 7th century who joined the Arabs, though as we shall see, only Arabs could rise to the top of society. The major difference between the Arabs who consumed the Eastern Roman Empire and the Germanic peoples who inherited the lands of the West was Islam itself. Whereas the Germans fairly quickly emulated the defeated Romans, in many cases adopting their language and custom, the Arabs had their own monotheistic religion, and very likely their own unique form of writing, with pre-Islamic scripts recently found carved into rocks out in the Jordanian desert. Furthermore, Arabia had already been home to its own ancient cities for thousands of years, and bordered advanced civilizations for much longer than the inhabitants of northern Europe. By the time of Muhammad, Arabs had served in both Roman and Persian armies for centuries. Yet, by the early 8th century, life under the Umayyads had become incredibly rigid and unchanging. This system of segregation between Arab and non-Arab had served well in cementing the culture of the empire, though in time it led to a marked divide between Arabs and everyone else. Even if they converted to Islam, marriages between Arabs and non-Arabs were still generally prohibited. One caliph, Umar II, had attempted to instigate reform in the late 710s, promising to throw down the divide. Yet, in doing so, he incurred the wrath of both the nobility and his fellow family members. He was poisoned after only 3 years in power. Up until just before Umar's reign in 717, the Umayyads had essentially steamrolled through everyone they came up against. As a result, they had been virtually undisputed in their rule. Due to this overwhelming success, it was generally assumed that God approved of their actions. Of course, there were setbacks, but these were generally temporary. In 717, however, a final attempt to conquer the Eastern Roman capital of Constantinople was launched. As many as 100,000 warriors set forth that year, and ultimately failed to conquer the great city. This defeat brought to the surface once more ancient resentments felt within the faith, carried out of Arabia with the faithful, old rivalries between Arabian clans, most notably the Qays, who originated from northern Arabia, and the Yamanis, who traced their lineage from the south, and increasingly between Iraqi and Syrian elements. Umar's successor, Yazid II, was content to live a hedonistic lifestyle in his desert palaces, and let his governors rule the empire, whilst maintaining the status quo of before Umar's time. Though the cracks had begun to show, and little did the Umayyads know, the seeds of their downfall were already being sown. Upon Yazid's death in 724, he was replaced by his much more austere and capable brother Hisham, often seen as the last great Umayyad Caliph. Hisham was in his 30s when he came to power, though little is known of him before this time, besides his outspoken opposition to the reforms of Umar. By the time Hisham came to power, though his reign is often seen as being peaceful in terms of domestic affairs, the Caliphate had significant external threats to combat. For the first time, the Muslims were on the defensive. Of course, summer expeditions continued against Byzantium, but on a much reduced scale, and the only place large-scale incursions continued to take place was into southern France, though a major setback was dealt out there in 732 by the Frankish warlord Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. By the 730s, the KHAZAR Khaganate, a powerful steppe confederation at times allied to the Eastern Roman Empire, came riding down through the Caucasus to ravage Muslim-held lands. Only with great effort were they pushed back to the north. At the same time, from the east, another Turkic confederation, the Turgesh, came sweeping down from the Central Asian plains to devastate Khorasan. They were only finally driven back in 737 due to the mobilization and militarization of local Iranian people, as well as an influx of some 20,000 Iraqi military settlers, who weren't necessarily loyal to the Umayyads. Another factor that would eventually have dire repercussions for the dynasty. Kharijite rebellions also flared up during this time. Devout Muslims who felt strongly that no hereditary dynasty should rule over the empire, with the most worthy for the position being elected instead. By 740, a full-scale revolt erupted in Iraq, with its leaders promising to put someone from the family of the Prophet on the throne. The Abbasids carefully laid low through all these events, and the rebellion was swiftly destroyed, ending in the violent deaths of many of its supporters. Arguably, the most devastating blow to Umayyad power also came in 740, when a massive Berber revolt broke out in North Africa. As they had gradually converted to Islam, the Berbers, increasingly influenced by Kharijite missionaries, had become more and more opposed to the Umayyads, and in 740 finally pushed them out of their territories for good. In 742, a massive Syrian invasion force dispatched to the region was defeated, and the survivors only just managed to push through to Spain. There they settled, though they found themselves now cut off and isolated from the rest of the Caliphate. By many accounts, Hisham's reign had been a success, and he is often seen as one of the greatest of all Umayyad caliphs. Yet, nevertheless, due to circumstances largely out of his control, he hadn't been good enough. defeat against the Berbers and the establishment of breakaway Islamic dynasties in northern Africa proved to be an existential threat to his house. The inability of the Caliphate to recover from these military disasters and setbacks, coupled with their failure to take Constantinople despite monumental efforts, not only undermined their legitimacy, but effectively sealed their end. The dynasty's main reason for existing had been to expand the territory of the faithful. As such, their reputation was inextricably bound to military success. When they were winning, they were unstoppable. As soon as they started to lose, it all came crumbling down. Though the collapse wasn't by any means a foregone conclusion, had a strong ruler succeeded Hisham, the Caliphate may have survived and even prospered once more. But nevertheless, the Caliph was worried about his successor. Knowing that his nephew Walid, the builder of Qasr Amra, and a man already possessing a reputation as a hedonistic playboy, stood a good chance of succeeding him. In 743, Hisham's worst fears were confirmed when Walid came to power upon the death of his uncle. Almost immediately, old grievances, as well as new ones, boiled up to the surface. Apparently strapped for cash, Al-Walid lured one Arab dignitary, Khalid al-Khazri, champion of the Yamani tribe, to his court, only to have his men seize him and bundle him off to his enemy, Yusuf ibn Umar, a leader of the Qays, in return for a vast sum of money. The unfortunate Khalid al-Khazri was tortured to death, thus sparking off all-out war between the two tribes once more. Though the vast Syrian army was still stationed all over the empire, providing a bulwark against anyone who might try their luck, left, right and centre, people were being murdered, and the tribal feud soon involved the entire army. It wasn't long before another Umayyad prince made a dash for power. Portraying himself as a reformer, much like Umar II before him, Yazid III dispatched a murder squad to the Umayyad palaces. There they came upon Al-Walid and murdered him as he sat defenceless in his palace, reading the Quran. After only 6 months in power, it was then Yazid's time to die, sparking off all-out civil war, as not only various Umayyad contenders competed for the throne, but a number of Shiite rebellions too rose up to seize power. Around this time, one Umayyad prince had fought his way to the top of the pile, portraying himself as the avenger of Al-Walid, and harking back to the old unreformed days of Hisham. Marwan, a regional commander operating out of a power base in the Armenian mountains, unlike Hisham before him, very much took a side in the conflict between Qays and Yaman, attempting to remove Yamanis from positions of power in Syria and replacing them with Qays loyal to him from the Jazeera and the Byzantine borderlands. As he descended upon the Syrian lowlands, such was their opposition to him, and the fear of reprisals, that many of the lords of Syria, old enemies with each other, even allied with the Kharijites in order to defeat Marwan, agreeing to overthrow the Umayyad regime. Yet it was all in vain. His allies in Armenia overthrown, it was all or nothing for Marwan as he made his claim for the caliphal title. By spring 748, Marwan, accompanied by his elite general Ibn Dubara, had won. Power now rested in the hands of Arabs from the mountains of Armenia and the Jazeera, though during the fighting, the heartlands of the empire had been devastated. Just to add to the chaos of the civil war, an earthquake shattered the region too. Yet, as soon as he took the caliphal title, Marwan would have already been aware of events taking place far to the east. For the Abbasids, after 30 years of preparation, had finally shown their hand. In the early summer of 747, flames of rebellion and civil war burning across the empire, the black banners of the Abbasids were finally raised in a suburb of the great Silk Road city of Merv. The colour was chosen as a direct rebuke to the white banners of the Umayyads, and almost immediately networks of supporters carefully cultivated over decades came into fruition as thousands of eager volunteers answered the call to arms. The revolution had begun. There were many leaders during the early days of the insurgency. An Arab nobleman named Suleiman Ibn Kathir had built up much of the infrastructure in Merv, painstakingly laying the groundworks for what was to come. Back in Kufa, a hotbed for ALIDS supporters and Shias, necessary allies in the war to come, and the de facto centre of opposition to Umayyad rule, it was Abu Salama who quietly worked behind the scenes, masterminding and coordinating efforts with his associates in Khorasan, some 20 days' march away. Qutaba ibn Shabib was a famed general who would eventually lead the march to Iraq to link up with the Kufans. Though most famous of all was a larger-than-life figure, the very embodiment and poster of the revolution. We know him as Abu Muslim, simply meaning son of a Muslim. Clearly not his real name, but one meant to embody the democratizing nature of the revolution. Perhaps an ex-slave, Abu Muslim is a shadowy figure. In around 741, Abu Muslim first made contact with the Abbasid agents in Kufa, and eventually he was introduced to the head of the family, Imam Ibrahim in Mecca. By 746, he had assumed leadership of the Hashimiyya in Khorasan, a position he would hold until his death. There had been revolts in Merv before, notably in 736, though this had been brutally suppressed and its leader Kidash killed. Times had changed, however, in the decades since the rebellion. Hisham was now gone, and in his place stood a gaggle of warring contenders. This revolt was different. With similar rebellions taking place from Iberia to Yemen, tearing the empire apart, the time was finally right. As always, the Abbasids left their campaign open-ended, preaching on behalf of an acceptable member of the family of the Prophet, after which time they had just as much chance of putting their own candidate on the throne as everyone else, thus gaining the support of the family of Ali, though, as we shall see, as the Abbasids pulled the strings, they could act earlier. In addition to this, in 741, the Umayyads had decreed that non-Muslims could not serve in government posts. The Abbasids were very aware of the discontent this caused, and made efforts to balance both the Muslim character of the revolution as well as its partially non-Muslim one. Militarily, the organisation of the Abbasid army was designed with the goal of ethnic and racial equality amongst its supporters. When Abu Muslim recruited mixed Arab and Iranian officers along the Silk Road, he registered them based not on their tribal or national affiliations, but on their current places of residence. This greatly diminished tribal and ethnic solidarity and replaced both concepts with a sense of shared interest. Methods to suppress the revolt were brutal yet ineffective, and in less than a month and a half, Abu Muslim's army rose to 7,000. Then, when a group of defeated Muslims of an anti-Umayyad revolt in Iraq turned up in Khorasan, this bolstered their numbers further. They marched to war. In the midsummer of 747, Within weeks of the black flags of the Abbasids being raised in Merv, Umayyad agents arrived in Humayma, still home to the sons of Muhammad ibn Ali. His heir, Ibrahim, the current leader of the Abbasid family, was seized, arrested and taken to the new caliph at his base in Haran. Though several of his family members escaped the roundup, Ibrahim was unceremoniously executed there and then. The rest fled Humayma to begin an exodus across the desert, eventually arriving at Kufa several weeks later with little more than the clothes they wore. There, the family of Abbas managed to make contact with sympathisers under the command of Abu Salama and were put up in a safe house to await the arrival of Abu Muslim from the east. Back in Khorasan, the numbers of the revolution continued to grow, with more and more anti-Umayyad elements coming together. By February 748, Merv fell, with the last Umayyad governor of Khorasan, Nasir ibn Sayyar, defeated and driven back to Nishapur in Iran in an attempt to continue the war. As with any revolution, it wasn't long before the reprisals began. 24 high-ranking officials were executed on Abu Muslim's orders. This was just the beginning. There were decades worth of scores to settle, and the Abbasids didn't hold back. As Abu Muslim remained in Khorasan to mop up any remaining resistance, his general, Qutaba ibn Shabib, led the charge into Iran and on into Iraq. He fought battle after battle against the crumbling Umayyad resistance before he was finally killed in battle in 749. It was his son Hassan who led the victorious army into Kufa in September of that year. Abu Muslim, meanwhile, definitively quashed all resistance in Khorasan and moved on to his main rivals within the revolution, discreetly killing his two main rivals, Uthman and Ali, and gaining the title Amir al-Muhammad, not just Amir, but undisputed master of the East. Only then did he turn his gaze towards Iraq and Syria. The combination of the arrival of the armies of Khorasan and an internal coup by a plethora of anti-Umayyad elements finally overthrew the rulers of Kufa in September 749, and soon afterwards the whole of Iraq would fall, though there was still no sign of the Abbasids yet. Abu Salama had hoped to stage manage the revolution, orchestrating himself into a position of power. Yet, with rumours circulating that he sought to put a member of the House of Ali in power, and with devout Khorasani warriors searching for the Abbasids in the city, if he had been planning a power grab, he botched it. On their own accord, a devout group of Khorasanis found the Abbasid safe house and pledged their allegiance there and then to Abu al-Abbas, the current leader of the family. Unlike his father and grandfather, Abu al-Abbas was an uninspiring man in his 30s, suffering from ill health. Yet, nonetheless, men from all over the realm came to pledge their allegiance to him as the first caliph of the new Abbasid dynasty. By early 750, Abu al-Abbas, now under the caliphal title of As-Safar, meaning the bloodshedder, began a speech to the assembled crowds, though due to his illness it had to be finished by his uncle. Of course, just like the power grab that had brought the Umayyads to power close to a century earlier, there were many who felt cheated by his near spontaneous assumption of the caliphal title. Foremost amongst them were members of the House of Ali, and by the time Abu Muslim arrived at the city with his elite army, the killing safety had been assured by the other leaders of the new regime, and himself acting as a vizier for several months, Abu Salama walked home one night. He was set upon and knifed to death. Of course, Abu Muslim denied the killing, attributing it instead to Kharijite rebels, but in reality, there was little doubt who was behind it. According to the later Abbasid historian Al-Tabari, some 60,000 people were killed by Abu Muslim during his time in power. Likely a highly inflated number, though not without at least some basis in reality. On the 25th of January 750, near the Great Azab River in northern Iraq, Abu Muslim's forces finally forced Marwan into a confrontation. Though outnumbered, the Abbasids were now veterans of many battles and buoyed up with morale from their victories. Abu Muslim ordered his men into a phalanx of spears, and when Marwan's cavalry surged forwards, they broke against the Abbasid line. Disheartened, the last Umayyad army fell apart into disarray. By April, the Abbasids stormed into Damascus, effectively putting an end to Syrian domination of the Arab world. Marwan attempted to flee into northern Africa, but by August, he and his family were tracked down in Egypt. Marwan, the last of the Umayyad Caliphs, died as he had spent his entire reign, fighting. All over the empire, Marwan's family members were tracked down and massacred. On one occasion, a group of 80 were offered asylum before being killed anyway. Similarly, the last Umayyad general, Al-Fazari, held out at the fortress of Wazit for several months, before being granted amnesty in return for his surrender. As soon as he exited the city, he was executed instead. Just one Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman, escaped all the way across northern Africa to seek refuge in Iberia, a place with widespread Syrian settlement, and he set up a breakaway Umayyad Caliphate there. After almost 3 years of rebellion, the Umayyad Caliphate came to an end. Umar's goal of reform had been achieved, but it had taken the demise of his dynasty and 30 years of bloodshed to achieve it. The new regime, spearheaded by the ruthless Abu Muslim, undisputed master of the far east of the empire, initially made its base at Kufa. Power was shifting away from Syria and towards Iraq and the east. Merv would remain a bastion of support for the Abbasids for centuries to come, whose reforms would lead to a cultural, scientific and artistic blossoming and a more eastward-looking outlook. There were many reasons for this shift in emphasis away from the west and towards the east. Firstly, the Silk Road was a vital source of revenue for the empire, with silver from Afghanistan, cotton and silk from China, and spices and jewels flowing up from India. Not to mention that the way to the west had been blocked by doggedly determined Byzantines, warlike Franks, breakaway Umayyads, and independent Berbers. And then, of course, there was the struggle to control Central Asia, a breeding ground of empires in centuries to come. For the Abbasids had a rival in the region, perhaps the only other state in the world with the resources, capability, and motive to fight the Caliphal army. For the Chinese also had their eyes set upon the glittering metropolises of the Silk Road, and in the wake of the Abbasid revolution, they sensed weakness. So it was in the year 751, hot off the heels of subduing their Tibetan neighbours on the high Himalayan plains, an imperial Tang army, numbering perhaps as many as 50,000 hardened warriors, set out towards the borders of Transoxiana. It is a testament to the unified nature of the Caliphate that even with a new dynasty in power, an army of roughly similar size could be mustered. And by day's end, it was the Muslims who came out on top, thus ensuring their continued influence in the region for centuries to come, and eventually the conversion of the natives to Islam. By 754, the sickly As-Sufar died, and his brother came to the throne, Abu Ja'far, ruling under the caliphal title Al-Mansur, a meticulous micromanager with seemingly endless energy, almost immediately embarked on a gargantuan policy of tying up loose ends from the old regime. Not only did he pursue a policy of endemic assassination and murder of any surviving Umayyad family members, but he also worked tirelessly to ensure their very name was blackened in the historical record, desecrating all of their graves besides Umar, still hailed today as the one good Umayyad prince. For centuries to come, when the Muslims wrote their own histories, many of them composed in literary Persian rather than Arabic, the Umayyads would be remembered as tyrants. Yet it wasn't only Umayyads that Al-Mansur targeted. Anyone that threatened him had to go. And in February 755, Abu Muslim, hero of the revolution, was quietly murdered. By the 760s, Al-Mansur embarked on his most ambitious project yet. A new city was to be built in the perfect location between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, a walled, circular city. Baghdad would grow to become the most populous and cultured city in the world, sponsoring trade and exploration missions all over the globe. Yet, of course, this prosperity had a price. One story, told by a former servant of the Caliph, relates that just before Al-Mansur died, he gave keys to his storerooms to his daughter-in-law, with strict instructions only to open one of them when she was sure of his death. Inside that room, preserved by the dry Mesopotamian air, she apparently found all of the Umayyads and members of the House of Ali whom Al-Mansur had executed. Hundreds of them, men, women and children, all meticulously labelled with their names and genealogies. Brutal he may have been, but Al-Mansur ensured not just the survival of the new dynasty, but its continued flourishing for centuries to come.